Okay. So if you remember for this series, we said that for the first four sessions, we would look at the corpus of traditional text and Jewish literature for any gleanings on, what our sages and rabbis had to say and thought about the afterlife. And we've explored a variety of options that have been prevalent in Jewish thought throughout our history. We've looked at reincarnation, resurrection, the idea of Sheol, this sort of biblical underworld, if you will, not to be confused with Hades and Greek mythology. We've talked about heaven and hell and the presence of that concept or those ideas either being or not being part of Jewish thought, and we've talked about the idea of sort of nothingness, of there being nothing after this life, and that perhaps being more of a reflection of this worldness and the focus on this world that we so often hear about and see in Judaism. What I'd like to do today, and I suspect we'll continue with in our final session, which will be the last Wednesday of this month. So we're going to skip 2 weeks. You will get a reminder email, and it will be on I believe, the 31st will be our last session. What I'd like to do today is take us a little bit out of the classical text tradition and into how it is that we experience in our kishkas the idea of death, grief, what might lie beyond, if anything, how we think about that, what it perhaps does for us in changing our focus or attitude about the world and the life we're in now. And I'd like to do that by sharing two very beautifully written and I think quite poignant entries from the Caring Bridge, which is Caring Bridge, many of you may know, is a website that allows folks who are going through some kind of illness or are in the hospital to communicate with a lot of people by entering journal entries. Sometimes family members will do it. And then instead of my having to reach out to every single one of you, I can post in my Caring Bridge, and then you can go there and read it if you are a permitted reader on the page. And so one of my acquaintances, she's not a close friend, but she's an acquaintance, is a woman named Tolu Quinn. Some of you may know her. She is the head of the Nashville Food Project here in Nashville, and really an amazing, full-hearted woman who received the diagnosis of a glioblastoma about, oh gosh, maybe 6 months ago now, which is amazing that she is still fighting and kind of going through this journey of living with what is most certainly a terminal cancer condition. And so Tolu has been journaling on her Caring Bridge account, and I want to share two, with her permission, which I have, two of her entries for us to use as a springboard to think about what it means, to think about death, what it looks like, and what awaits us beyond. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Rabbi Kulik, to be in reflective conversation with me about these texts. I'm going to screen share them with you. I think it's easier sometimes to both hear someone read while also getting the advantage of seeing the words yourself for process purpose. And just know that while Rabbi Kulik and I will be in conversation about these texts, these entries, my hope is that we'll open it for all of us to have an opportunity to reflect, if you'd like to, later on in the hour. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and begin with the first entry from that I'd like to share of the two today. Okay. Okay, so this is the first entry. I'm learning how much I can do in a day, which is much less than I used to do, but it's still a whole lot, and I feel a deep, deep sense of gratitude for that. I take naps most days and build fires in our fire pit and walk into Green Hills to get groceries and make dinner most nights. There's so much I can't do and so much out of my control, so I've noticed how much I'm drawn to tasks I can control around the house. Purging closets, taking art to be framed, going through boxes of photos, picking up kindling in the yard, and I've even been ironing linen napkins. Until last month, I hadn't ironed anything in 2 decades. All this is to say, Reinhold Niebuhr's profound serenity prayer has never resonated in a more obvious and helpful way. Maybe death is not the worst thing. My friend James offered this thought in conversation a few months back. He wasn't exactly saying it to me, but to both of us as something to consider and reflect on. I remember wanting to be brave enough to believe it, and I've thought about the question most days since. Maybe death is not the worst thing? With the tragic number of COVID deaths in the last year, death and dying is in the collective ether. And for me, my family, and our community, questions and fears about death are constant these days. As I fold the laundry and organize the Tupperware, I've been wondering, though, maybe death really isn't the worst thing. But if it's not the worst thing, then what is? As I continue to reflect on it, I keep coming back to the different ways our modern culture fails to embrace life and all its joys. Perhaps the worst thing is not death, but the ways we cover up our own desire to express deep reverence for life. We enslave ourselves to work, to our screens, to distraction and denial, all forms of oppression. We chain ourselves to power and wealth and comparison and measuring up to someone else's ideas of who we ought to be. We covet their opinion of us. We stay small. We dull the shine, dim the inner light. We armor up our vulnerabilities and use our coldness as weaponry. We want to see people for who we want them to be instead of who they are. We mute the gifts of others. Some of us barely scrape together enough calories from ketchup packets, while others of us scrape full meals off our plates into the garbage disposal. We extract and privately own what is not ours. We appropriate and exploit. We do not face and admit to the violent and racist beginnings of our nation, the legacies of which persist into the present day and live in me. I have been complicit in all of this. I have provoked this pain, been complacent to this pain, suffered at the hand of this pain. And our collective pain gets so lodged in us that we become incapable of praise and joy, and we pass on our hurts to our children, and the cyclical nature of generational pain continues. This sounds a bit like our Barosh Hashanah and Unatana Tokef portions of our High Holy Day liturgy, does it not? Culturally, we do not make a lot of room to grieve. We gloss over another's depth of sorrow or even our own. We move on. We say nothing. Out of respect, we do not name the pain, and the great irony is that a failure to name it keeps the hurting one in a state of hurt. I remember meeting over lunch with my friend Sarah in New York years ago when I was going through a difficult time after my cousin Beth died by suicide. I felt so close to her, and yet how did I not know she was suffering so deeply? I think Sarah picked up on a lot of self-judgment for what I was feeling at that time and said to Lou, feelings just are. They're not good or bad. They just are. That had never, ever occurred to me. This aversion to embracing or sharing our true feelings swings in both directions. It's not only difficult to express deep sadness and grief, but also praise and love and desire. The vulnerability required for both is enormous. Perhaps failure to grieve is connected to cultural influences, not to embrace life. I've been listening to a book my friend Brooke recommended called The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise. He narrates it, the author, Martin Pretchell, and I love the cadence and sound of his voice. The core theme is that grief is always linked to praise, necessarily. And we have a cultural aversion to grieving because we don't know how to adequately praise the miracles of this life all around us. So maybe death is not the worst thing, but becoming so numb that we don't even grieve our losses is. And loss is, of course, not always death, but includes any experience when someone or something we want disappears or goes away. I'm learning now that grieving is an obligation. When our sadness is not properly processed in grief, it shows up as anger and violence towards self and others, as depression or abuse, as constant dissatisfaction. When we don't do our own grieving, we burden someone else with it. Last piece. How do we grieve? I guess the only way out is through. I'm learning that grief is active, not a static state of sadness or sorrow to stay in. What does active grieving look like? Years ago, I had the privilege of sitting with my friend Holly at the cafe at Thistle Farm. She talked with this light in her eyes about her incredible daughter, Lauren, who had died years before. So vulnerably, she shared with me the work she did to grieve her daughter's tragic death. And I was in awe of her bravery and acceptance of what had come to be, and how actively she embraced a process of grieving. It still moves me to think about this. Deeply grieving my death is the obligation I have to this life I love. I will not shrink from the sadness I feel, but neither will I quit my imperfect praise. I crashed into life like a wave, and like all waves, I will return to my source, the bigger body of life from which I was made. I do not know when the final pull and recede will happen, but it will for me and it will for you. Have I done all I was meant to do up here on the shore? Have I paid good attention? Did I adequately praise all there is to love here? Okay, we probably could read that over about 3 more times. But, Rabbi, I'd like to just begin by asking what you think about and what specifically Jewish stands out to you in her piece.
Uh, so I would say that, the most moving part of all this is the way she is facing the death. For people who don't know Talu is a young woman, and if Judaism speaks about how we should live our lives, and how do we learn the best way to go through our lives, I think that what this piece is a wonderful reminder is, living a good life includes learning how to die a good death,
Mm,
which is not easy. It's way easier to say than to do it. And I feel the incredible burden that she's carrying while she's writing. It's like teaching how to die, is not for everyone. Let's say that. I've been privileged to see some people who were dying, and who were masters of dying with dignity and grace, but it's not easy. So that is the first thing that resonated with me.
mhm.
Um, and then a couple of other things, and then I will let you say something. She at the very beginning, she quotes this prayer, the Serenity Prayer, that during this pandemic in particular, I have been thinking plenty about this. For those of you who don't know what this prayer is all about, it's the famous prayer who says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Okay, which is rooted originally in the philosophy of the Stoics in ancient Greece, but at the same time, it's a very Jewish idea of understanding and knowing how to separate that. We do that work of separation between what is worth and what is not, between what is holy and what is not. We finish Shabbat with Avdalah, which is the separation. We begin every morning, and the first morning, the first blessing that we say in Birkot HaShachar is that we thank God because God has given the wisdom to the rooster to distinguish between day and night. Okay, and the word sechvi is not only a rooster but also one of the words for lev, for heart. So we thank every day God for having this ability. Not that it comes easily to us, we need to work on that, but those were the things that I kept thinking about. And again, the Serenity Prayer, this understanding, this very, very important homework of learning what we can change and is under our control, and what we cannot change because it is not under our control. And so worrying or transforming those things that we cannot change into the sources of our pain will put us always in a very tough spot. So learning what we can change and what we cannot can be a liberating exercise as well. So I would say this, and I will bring it back to you.
Thank you. I was struck, and we're going to open it before we go to the second entry to the group. I was struck by this connection, this intersection of grief and praise, because our daily liturgy is essentially our praise workout, if you will. Some of us go to the gym or hop on a treadmill or take a walk each day to keep our body physically fit. Our liturgy gives us an opportunity daily. And if you're not a daily practitioner of Jewish prayer, but maybe you're a Shabbat practitioner, then it's a weekly opportunity to remember to offer praise, to remember to be grateful. We are the idea of mindfulness and gratitude offering originates in Jewish tradition. We always think we need to go out to kind of the mystical, Buddhist, kind of New Age practices and traditions when we engage in mindfulness and meditation, but it's very much rooted in Jewish practice. So our prayers give us these exercises in praise, but we forget that. We don't focus on what we're saying. We don't focus on the meaning behind it so often. It's easy to kind of zone out and just go through the repetition of the words. But the idea being that the deeper we appreciate and notice and elevate our awareness, which is what the mitzvot, the commandments, are meant to do, elevating our awareness from the mundane to something that's miraculous, right? I see a rainbow and I could just walk by and think, oh, that looks nice. But if I stop and say a blessing, I've taken that moment and I've made it something extraordinary. And it's the same thing when we make a motzi before we eat, or a kiddush before we drink, or saying Birkat Hamazon after finishing a meal. It's taking a moment that could otherwise just pass by without notice and making it something sacred. And praise allows us to dig something deep inside us, this well of gratitude that then also allows us to feel grief really deeply. And that the grief continues to dig that well, and it becomes cavernous, but then the joy has so much more to fill up. And I think there is a correlation between one who cannot or does not allow themselves to experience grief can only experience joy to a certain extent. And if we are meant to be focused on the most we can make for ourselves and others in this world, in this lifetime, as Tulu would say, on this shore, then we have to allow ourselves the vulnerability to praise life fully so that we can grieve our losses fully as well. That's my biggest takeaway from her piece. And I think, she is familiar with Jewish tradition and has plenty of Jewish friends that she, draws upon that wisdom as well. And you see that in her writing. I want to open it in case there's a comment or reflection at this time. Steve.
Yeah, I think there's a difference in grief when the knowledge of death is sort of foretold, like Tulu, versus a sudden death, like a heart attack. And so there is time to prepare and grieve both before and after with Tulu's situation, whereas with a sudden death, the grief for us is very different. And I think that's something that we need to take into account is particularly in counseling people, in determining the situation that they're facing.
Thank you, Steve. There's no doubt that, each circumstance is its own unique scenario and requires kind of a different element of fortitude. Yeah.
Now, I would add to that, because I agree. both in terms of the, if it is our own case, or when we are grieving for somebody else, the loss of somebody we love. It's two different things. But I, when you, Steve, were saying this, I was reminded of a text that shows in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, if I remember correctly, that says that we should always do tshuva as if tomorrow would be the last day.
Sure.
With the idea that since we never know when the last day is gonna be, we should be working on this on a daily basis. Now, it's very hard. It's like and tons of books have been written about this. We tend to forget that we all have an expiration date, because that is what allows us to keep moving forward. The thought of seeing the expiration date right here on the horizon coming our way is certainly not easy to swallow. So we tend to forget. But religions, I think, are in many regards, one of the important things that religions do is to offer us the structure to prepare for these things. There is one book that I read in the last year, Rebecca Solnit. She is known by, because she wrote a book like Men Explain Things to Me. Some of you have heard maybe the book, but she has a ton of different books. And one of the books that I like the most that she wrote is a book by the name of A Paradise Built in Hell. And so, among other things, she says that religions can be regarded as disaster preparedness, because by telling us that we need to face mortality and death and illness and loss and uncertainty and suffering, we are being given the tools that if we use, that's on us, but if we use, we can prepare ourselves slightly better. The truth is that when death strikes, it strikes. That's it. It's not that there is any way to dodge that. But I like this idea of religions as preparing us by pushing us to face these very important, difficult moments in our lives. This is something that shows in Solnik's writings, in Alain de Botton writings, and in so many others, how religions and I'm quoting these folks because neither Solnit nor Alain de Botton are religious persons, like faith type of persons, and yet they are smart enough to understand that religions can bring something that is very, very valuable to the table, and that whether you believe in something beyond or not, the point is how you can use those tools to prepare yourselves as well.
Okay? And it's essentially provides a structure, if you will. And you think about other difficult things that we go through in life. Think about a 10-step program for somebody who's trying to beat alcoholism. It provides a structure by which to move through something that's really challenging, that we want to believe we have our own inner strength that can take us there, but really we need something else to guide us and to be able to lean on. I often say that religion is the lens through which we best understand the world and our place within it. And death is no exception to understanding the world and our place within it. What is that for us? How is it that we're experiencing it for ourselves and for others? Her speaking about being kind of a wave that goes and recedes, that comes and recedes, just the idea, the Ecclesiastes, Kohelet idea of, the way, and we looked at this text together when we were talking about resurrection, that, what goes comes back again. And this idea that, it's part of this cycle, and yet each one of us is imbued with an ego that says, yes, but I'm different and special. I'm the unique wave. So what does it mean for me? And I think that's pretty normal human reaction. Andrea had put a note in the chat. I don't know if you all saw it, that about saying the Shehekianu after receiving the first of 2 shots for the COVID vaccine. And I really resonated to Rabbi Naomi Levy's prayer for receiving the vaccine. If anybody wants it, it's now in the chat, and you can copy and paste it so you have it for, even if you've already received it, there's no reason you can't. It's never too late to say a blessing. That's what I would say. So you can still use that. Other thoughts or comments before we continue on? Okay. Well, let me share again. One more entry to share with you for thought and conversation today. It starts with a poem. And the poem is by Wendell Berry. It is appropriately called Sabbaths, Shabbatot. We travelers walking to the sun can't see ahead, but looking back, the very light that blinded us shows us the way we came, along which blessings now appear, risen as if from sightlessness to sight, and we, by blessing brightly lit, keep going toward that blessed light that yet to us is dark. She writes, I'm moving through these days on the prayers of many. I feel physically depleted, emotionally exhausted, and have cried so much and so hard this week. It feels like all my strength is required to do the daily things and make it to bedtime. On a glioblastoma listserv, someone newly diagnosed asked a question of long-term survivors. A long-term survivor for this type of cancer is considered living with it for 3 or more years since diagnosis. What's your secret? The newly diagnosed listserv member asked. Answers range from taking specific supplements to strictly adhering to a ketogenic diet, to petitioning God in prayer, to extreme exercise regimens. One answer caught my eye, a member who offered, I just live my life. What would it look like for me to just live my life? Living as I used to live before my diagnosis isn't the answer, and neither is living as though I don't have terminal cancer. Why do we live with the assumptions that the future we cannot yet see will give us both time and health? But now I'm learning that facing death is teaching me how to live. Even in my sadness and exhaustion and longing, I feel an extra amount of gratitude for the regular stuff, my weekly work call, packing my kids' lunches, brushing their hair after showers at night, taking walks in the park across the street, eating dinner with our best neighbors, and drinking coffee in the mornings with my husband. All of that bliss. I have so many questions and fears, not just about human death in general terms, but also about my death in particular. I've learned from my doctors that the brain can't feel pain, and yet it is the body center out of which pain is experienced. I've also learned that brain cancer is not metastatic and does not travel to other parts of the body as metastatic tissue. Since this cancer will not metastasize and do a fatal takeover of other organs, I've asked my oncologist what people with glioblastoma die from. Or in other words, what I might die from. A brain hemorrhage, cardiac event, seizure, coma? And will it be peaceful? I imagine I won't be alone when it happens, but will I feel alone? Will I be in our bed? Will my husband sleep in that bed after? Will I be lucid and able to talk with my family? What will they witness at the event of my death? Will they be scared? Will I? A few nights ago, I was snuggling our son, who is 6 years old. I was holding him, and unprompted, he started to pray, Dear God, could you please make sure to take away all the cancer from my mom's brain? She's right here in the bed with me if you need to find her. But the truth is that I've already been found. Even as I rage through the present sorrow to the unknowable future that will be my early death, I can look back into the past and see all who have loved and supported me. They are the blessings brightly lit. You, friends, are accompanying me as I walk into the blinding unknown of the future. The very light that blinded us shows us the way we came. I've been living with this profound poem above by Wendell Berry for a decade, and its meaning is constantly being revealed to me. I love how the future is described as both dark, because we can't see into it yet, but also as a blinding light, since we encounter events ahead of us that we are confident will do us in or take us under. As we look toward them, they appear so difficult and insurmountable, and yet we find faith and resilience and the company of many who journey with us. In all of that, what appears to be impossible rises into some kind of embraceable blessing. We don't know that the difficulties of our present situation will reveal themselves as future blessings. We can't know. Getting terminal cancer at age 40 was a blinding light. And yet, in these last 8 months, I've been found by love and continue to be held in love, while together we keep going toward this blessed light that is yet to us dark. What, if anything, does Judaism offer us as we approach death? Because there's so little in our text that talks about, we've seen and glanced over the last 4 sessions, our first 4 sessions together, at what our tradition might have to offer about what comes next. But we really didn't touch on, and there's scant mention of what it is that we might take stock in or anchor in as we move in that direction towards a possible afterlife. If you'll remember in our Torah text, the phrase, and he or she was gathered to his kin, right, was offered. And we talked about that as not really mentioning much about the afterlife at all, but this idea that perhaps wherever those whom we love go after this life, that when it's our turn, we will be with them once again. And that perhaps is a comforting notion for many, and maybe a way in which we feel more at ease with our own mortality. But beyond, and Rabbi, I'm going to ask you this question, but beyond the idea of being gathered to our kin, in your recollection, what in our biblical text or in our commentaries perhaps, or in any of your readings, gives us direction beyond sort of the structure of there's 7 days of Shiva, and that's how we grieve others, but preparing for ourselves? Is there anything from our tradition that stands out to you?
It's a good question. You are asking very good questions, Rabbi.
And to be fair, I feel like for our studio audience, I did not give this question to Rabbi Kulik in advance, so I am putting him on the spot.
Fine, I will try my best. I'll do what we rabbis do all the time. We associate, and we take the conversation wherever it's comfortable for us.
Rabbis and politicians, by the way.
Yes, that's true too. So the first thing, I think that there is a reason for the lack of, madrich. So like there is no a guide that, it's very hard to guide somebody to his or her own death, because as I think Sartre, or Camus, or any of the existentialists said, and probably they were not the only ones saying this, death is something that we always experience related to somebody else. We don't get to experience our own death, so it's very hard to prepare for something that we don't get to experience until we get there. Okay, so the lack of guidance, I think, is a smart thing to do, because nobody knows, and it's like Talou says, it's a light that is blinding.
Right.
And so there is that tension. And so I am reminded of a story in the Talmud. The Talmud has, many wonderful vignettes, and in one of those related to death, it tells the story of a rabbi who dies and then shows up in the dreams of another rabbi. So the rabbi who is dreaming about the dead rabbi, who is not a dream, it's just the rabbi presenting himself in that dream. So the rabbi who is sleeping asks the dead rabbi, "Rabbi, is death painful?" To which the dead rabbi, speaking through the dream, says, "Not at all. Dying is like taking a hair out of a glass of milk. What we are afraid is not, so we are afraid of dying. That is the painful experience. It's not death itself. It's the fear of death that pains us the most." So this is what the story says. But it doesn't end there. So the rabbi who is sleeping says to the rabbi in the sleep, so rabbi, if dying is not painful, would you be willing to come back alive and die again? To which the rabbi who is already dead says, no way. Which is, I think, a deep insight into the fact that death does not hurt, according to this story, doesn't take away the fear of death. That
Right.
is the painful experience of how we, settle the score with the idea of our own mortality. So I don't think that there are many good advices on what's the best way to live this world. But and I think that there is some wisdom for that, because nobody left and came back to tell us. Um, but at the same time, reflecting again, and probably we will come back to this idea in our last class, it's very clear how the consciousness of our mortality is a big changer in our priorities.
Yeah.
It's what she is going all the time saying, and we all know it, and yet we are not shaken until we are shaken.
Right.
So, and maybe that's the way how by recognizing the finitude, we revisit our priorities, and we do differently, because, and she says this as well, we need to break with the assumption that the future will give us only good health and long life.
Right.
It's like we live under that assumption.
Yeah.
But that is magical thinking. In some cases, it's going to be true. But again, most of the time, Rabbi Brad Artson, who has written about special needs in general, not only about dying, but special needs, he says that, we all have special needs. The only difference is that some of us may have not discovered what our special needs are going to be as we continue to grow old. So it's like when we understand that idea, when we prepare, when we try to invest today for the well-being of our future self, all of those things are coming to mind. And so they may not teach us how to die the right death, but at least they may help to to better the odds.
Yeah.
For a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
And you make me think, thank you for that, of I don't know, it may be a midrash, but it also may be a story that was just sort of made up, but has been kind of passed around rabbinic circles. But I love the story that explains the two central lines of the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. And the story goes, which I may have shared, sometimes I can't remember if I'm repeating myself, so that might come with COVID and or getting older. I'm not sure. It might be a combo. But the story goes that the Shema was actually those two lines, which are in fact a recitation and a repetition, a doxology, if you will. The prayer leader leads the first line. The second line is often recited silently, or in a much lighter tone, softer tone. And the idea is that, or the story goes that the Yisrael, the Israel in the first line, Shema Yisrael, is not the people Israel, but is in fact Jacob. Because as we know, Jacob, our Genesis forefather, was renamed Yisrael, the one who struggles with God and prevails after he wrestles with this mysterious Ish in the desert. He's renamed Yisrael. And so the first line of the Shema, Shema Yisrael, listen, Jacob, is when Jacob is dying and he gathers his children around him and he says, and he expresses that he is fearful of leaving them because he wants to know as a parent that they will be okay. And I think that one of the fears of dying is that, will the people I love the most be okay without me? And they see that he is strained and in anguish over this idea that he's leaving them. And they say, Shema Yisrael, listen Father, listen, Jacob, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We got everything you taught us. We know that Adonai is our God. We know that there's one God. And that acts as a merism. Because we know that, we know everything you taught us. We've internalized it. We are going to be okay. You have taught us well, and we will now be able to carry on your values and live good lives. And he, comforted by those words, responds in a strained voice because he's near death. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Praise to God that that is the case. I can now go with much less anguish because I know that the people I love will be okay without me. And I just always found that to be a beautiful story and way to understand those two lines of the Shema, because I think that in a way it's our tradition saying to us, Judaism is so much about living in the gray. We don't have a dogma for so many things. The afterlife is just one of them. And so it's no surprise that how it is we might face and prepare for death and make the most of the life we're living as a way of honoring our mortality. It's no surprise there's no prescription for that, except one might say that the commandments and living a joyful Jewish life is certainly a good first step along that way. So I want to open it for reflections on the second entry that we shared from Tolu. If others have thoughts or questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself. It's a quiet group.
Yeah. Today they are quieter than usual.
We're pondering our own mortality.
Rabbi?
Yes, Nanette.
Yeah, I have to say that when listening, to the second entry, I found that the unknown was the pain, was very painful. And just like Rabbi was saying, I agree with that's a really painful part of coming to terms is the unknown. Of course, that's why we're taking this course. But I don't see, even though like logically you have to try and prepare society and everything around us, it's a kind of dichotomy because we're not supposed to dwell. I mean, this is how you're taught on, dying, because then you're an old lady, you're worrying about dying, but yet there's a part of you that needs to psychologically prepare yourself. So the complexity of it all is almost daunting because of the expectations of society, having no blueprint, because our faith, as you were so eloquently saying, how it's laid out. And I just find it to be a daunting task.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, what I'm saying.
I think you're saying what a lot of people are feeling, Nanette, and that it is daunting. And, I think you pointed out, whether you meant to or not, that there's a difference between, will death be painful physically and will death be painful emotionally?
Right, because I recall
dying and then there's death. Yeah.
My mom passed away when I was young, and she was only like 42. And I remember it was a sudden situation. And I remember staying up all night, just praying to God to just let me see her one more time. Of course, that didn't happen. But, it's left me with a very like almost like a void of like, you pray and you're looking for something, I guess, when you're young, because things happen so fast. So death is just something that happens, and I guess it's just you have to cope, you have to deal with it and find the right way to get through it all. So anyway.
Thank you.
Julie?
A number of years ago when my kids were really young, someone from their friend's family died. And I remember we sat around the kitchen table, it was dinner time, and one of them looked up and said, I think it was my son, said, "Are you going to die?" And I remember the conversation. We were at that point in our early 40s. And I remember at the time, we said, oh, we're young, you don't have to worry about that. And about a year and a half to 2 years later, my husband died. And my son at that time said, but you told us that we didn't have to worry about it. So none of us, I think, really expect to die at an early age, which is what, Toulou's facing. And to prepare for I think there is no way to prepare for that. There is the sense, I am now in my 70s and I'm looking at, death somewhere down the road here now where I didn't as when I was younger. But there's still no way to kind of reconcile your life with an abrupt ending.
Yeah.
And I don't know, lately I've been looking, it's strange, but I've been looking at the universe, not just, here's our world right here, but there is this vast universe out there. And what part my infinitesimal life has in relation to that enormous universe that we don't even know about.
Mm-hmm.
So, some of that is related to my thoughts about death, but some of it's related to my thoughts about life and who we are and where we are and why we are. So anyway.
No, thank you for saying what you did, Judy. And I think sometimes thinking about our lives in relation to the universe so vast can be disconcerting, and sometimes it can be uplifting and an opportunity for expansion. And anyway, Kitty, you just mentioned in the chat, which I think is an interesting thing to bring out, that the concept of eternity is what is disconcerting for you. This idea, and it's not so different than this sort of vast universe that Judy's referring to. What's disconcerting about it, if you don't mind sharing?
You will have to unmute, Kitty, before you begin. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I guess it is partly what Judy said, but just there's no structure. In my mind, there's no structure, and there's no beginning, no end. There's the uncertainty or unknown aspect just seems to get hugely greater, and that I think it's partly that.
I'm so glad you said that, and thank you for bringing up this idea of eternity, because I think on the one hand, we are comforted by the structure of the finitude of life that we're in right now. That we know there's a beginning, it's birth. Some of us have given birth, we've all been born. At some point we experience birth as taking the ride, and maybe we've seen other births and been there for them, and we know that there's an end. And again, many of us have shepherded somebody through that portal, or been there when a loved one has passed, which I think is, while it can be very difficult, is also a privilege in many ways. And so even though we have all sorts of issues around death, will it be painful? Will my loved ones be taken care of? Will I be scared? Will I be alone? There's still something comforting about the enclosure of it. Like, we know this life begins at a certain point and 100% it ends at a certain point. So the idea that it might not be like that afterwards feels like we'll be just floundering, like it's just endless or never ending. But what's so interesting to me that I come back to, similarly as Judy does with this idea of kind of this life and its place in the universe, is, well, why do I expect that there won't be some other structured experience after this life? I think about that all the time. I don't know that there will be, and I don't know that there won't be, but why would I assume that there's not? And I want to share one more thing with you all today, which is a piece by Rabbi David Wolpe in a wonderful book called Floating Takes Faith. And it's one of my favorites. I share it often at a Shiva because I just think it's good food for thought. And it goes like this: is this life all? The question of the afterlife has been debated throughout history, although the Bible makes scant mention of the possibility. The Talmud is filled with the idea of Olam Haba, the world to come. The classic Jewish compendium on the laws of death and mourning, Gesher HaChaim, the Bridge of Life, opens with an intriguing analogy. It asks the reader to imagine twins lying together in the womb. One of them believes irrationally that there is a world beyond the womb. The other is convinced such beliefs are nonsense. Suddenly, the believer is forced through the birth canal. Imagine, asks the author, how the twin left behind must view this. A great catastrophe has just befallen the other. Outside the womb, however, the parents are rejoicing, for what the twin left behind has just witnessed is not death but birth. Perhaps this is a gestational world. Could death be a birth? As the great Henry James wistfully said, it takes a whole life to learn how to live, which is absurd if there is not another life in which to apply the lessons. I love that piece. I mean, what if this life is a gestational life and eternity is our mishigas that just breeds fear? We don't know is what it comes down to. And some of us just can't get beyond not knowing. The not knowing is the scariest piece. Barbara.
Hi. Yeah, it's taken me a little bit of time to process some of the things that Tolu wrote about in the first section. So I just wanted to jump back to that for a minute.
Absolutely. And that's, I know.
Well, there's just a lot.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, because I get caught up a lot as well in the mechanics of dying and what it will feel like and the fear and all that stuff. But the thing that really resonated with me, what she said, is that dying is not the worst thing, and that the worst thing from her perspective is not to enjoy the blessings of the life that we have and not to live life well. And I've seen people that I care about go through life that way, not being happy, not, cursing everything that befalls a privileged life and things like that. And I've always been struck with how sad it is that somebody I care about just can experience no joy. And to see somebody who's on the verge of death kind of frame it that way is really moving to me, that dying may not be the worst thing, because we don't know. It could be fabulous, but what we do know is what we are here for now, and to not make the most of that is really a tragedy. And so if I can get out of the fear and obsession about what it's going to feel like to die, and think about that, there's a lot of comfort in that concept, because what we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know, but we do know what's here now.
And it's so well said, Barbara. It makes me think of the Hashkivenu prayer, which we say in the evening. And there's no more statement of faith and conviction that what we don't know to be true, we're just assuming is, which is, I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to wake up to life renewed. Well, who says? But we just assume it every single evening. And we say that prayer. We ask for a Sukkot Shalomecha, a shelter of peace from God. But why do we not apply the same level of faith to what might be next? Why is it that it's nothingness or this abyss that just goes on and on forever, that's dark and we're lonely and it's scary, and maybe we've watched too many movies or seen too much TV or read too much sci-fi. I don't know what it is, but we exhibit deep, profound faith in so many other areas of our life, our Jewish lives, and yet this is a hurdle. It really is. So that was very well put. Janet, and then Jane.
Kind of had a revelation last night that I can apply to this today. Forgive me if I give you a little backstory. I met my husband in a recording studio when I was producing broadcast spots and he was an engineer. And off and on, we've, worked together through the years, but just recently I've taken on a project, and yesterday we were working on radio spots together again, and he was engineering and I was producing. So last night he walks in to the den and he says, you know, we've come full circle. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, think about it. He said, this is how we met over 40 years ago. And he said, and now we've come right back around to where we began. So we've come full circle. And I said, oh yeah, I can see what you're talking about. And in having this discussion today, I'm kind of view life, birth, death as a full circle. But I think you circle that circle probably many more than one times. So I think maybe you start somewhere in that circle, you come back to it, you surpass it again, and possibly we just keep going. And all of us are in our own orb, and maybe that orb is intersected or encompassed with the orbs of others that we love, and it's a continual revolution. Just food for thought.
I love the food for thought, Janet. Thank you for sharing that very much. Jane.
My mother died of brain cancer. And so we knew, I mean, you never know when somebody exactly is going to die, but she had a finite amount of time and she was told how much time. And, you know, she lived close to that time limit. And I'm married to a physician who had seen many people die. I had never seen anybody die. I was terrified of what it was going to be like. Was my mother going to be in pain? Was, you know, the whole process. And, you know, it was both my husband and I were with my mother when she took her last breath, and we were holding her hand, and it was extremely peaceful. And it's just like, I'm not afraid of dying anymore. My mother lived a beautiful death. She wrote an ethical will, as did my grandfather. There's a tradition in my family of doing that. And, you know, that when you said, what do you learn from life? I hope you learn certain lessons that you pass on to your children and to the people that you love. And I think that's when we say, may his memory or her memory be for a blessing. That's what I hope we do when we live, you know, and when you die, you pass that on to somebody else. So I'm not afraid. I used to be afraid of dying, but I'm not anymore. I mean, I don't happen to want to die tomorrow, but you know.
We don't want that for you either, but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and also I have one other question. You record this. Where can we see your recording? Because I would really like to see those passages that Tolu wrote.
So those passages, and you're welcome to them. Your rabbi has a copy of them. And Rabbi Kulak, I'll send you the ones that I actually used as a screen share today, because those are, I think, a little bit edited. So you can go ahead and just request those from Rabbi Kulak, or you can request them from me, either way, whichever's easier. And the recording, I think, Rabbi, where do you put the recording?
So the first two sessions are at the West End YouTube channel, and the last two, and probably this one as well, will be at Micah's YouTube channel. But, you know, it's same YouTube links.
Yeah.
And, you know, we probably, if we have the emails of everybody, which I think we do, by the end of the series, we should send the final email with the emails to all of the recordings, so that people can.
Yeah, I have somebody who's visiting me in the next week or so, and I would really like this person to see this session.
Well, that will be a possibility. So just if you can't find it or I'm able to access it, just reach out to either one of us.
Okay, thank you so much.
For sure, for sure. Well, we are at just 2 minutes after 1 o'clock, and we like to be respectful of your time. So I want to say thank you for participating in a little bit of a different kind of session. And again, just a reminder, we'll be together again at noon on the 31st. So we'll see you in 3 weeks. And in the meantime, I hope it is a joyful, safe, but meaningful Hag. Passover will be here before we're back together again. In fact, we'll be together during the week of Pesach. So maybe we'll break a little matzah and bless together when we're back. So, all right, everyone, an early Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.